All right, awesome. I think we can go ahead and kick this off. So, again, welcome to everybody. Thanks for joining us today. This is our second event for the Mitigating Bias in Analytics series that Women in Analytics is hosting in partnership with Tableau. I'm super, super excited about this second session. If you were able to join us last 2 Wednesdays ago, we actually hosted Renee Cummings for our first session, our kickoff session around data collection. It was an excellent conversation. And so I'm really, really excited to follow up that conversation with our three panelists today to talk about design. And, I think in the last session, we had someone from Tableau really talking about how meaningful this particular topic was for them as an organization. So we're super grateful for Tableau for partnering with us for this series. So like I said, we're going to have a panel discussion today with our three panelists, and I will introduce them in just a moment. I wanted to quickly go through the agenda. So we're going to spend the first 5 minutes with some very high-level administrative items, and then we will jump into the good stuff at 12:05. And then we will have our panel discussion for about 35 minutes. As you start to think of questions, please feel free to start messaging inside of the Q&A. So if you see the Q&A on the side, go ahead and start putting your questions in there throughout the discussion. We will get to that towards the end. So we'll leave about 15 minutes for your questions. Take advantage of this opportunity while we have these three women present for the event today. And then the last 5 minutes, we'll talk about some closing remarks, some upcoming events that we have going on, and how to access this webinar recording. And then finally, as a part of this series, we launched this new optional networking. So if you want to stick around and meet some of the other attendees that are joining us from around the world, feel free to do that. In the last notification and reminder email that we sent you, there's 2 links, the one for this webinar and the second one is for the networking event. So towards the end of the event, I'll give you more instructions, but just click that link and then join us in that webinar meeting. We'll break out into some smaller breakout rooms and have a really good discussion to follow up the panel discussion we have today. A little bit about this series. So like I said, this is called the Mitigating Bias in Analytics series. It is a free virtual series that features panel discussions and fireside chats that we can talk about ways to identify and mitigate bias in the analytics process. So basically, we have these events every other Wednesday. Like I said, they are free, so feel free to join us for the rest of the series that extends into October. A little bit about Women in Analytics. So we exist to increase visibility to the women making an impact in the analytics space and provide a platform for women to lead the conversations around the advancements of analytical research, development, and applications. We have a brand new membership platform that is launched. So if you're interested in staying connected with us and connecting with our community, feel free to join the membership as well. We do have a free level of membership, so check out the different benefits that we offer for that. Like I said, thanks so much to Tableau for partnering with us on this event series. It means a lot to us, and I know it means a lot to them as well. And a few webinar tips. So if you have any audio issues, here's an email that you can send us. If you're having issues seeing anything, hearing anything, feel free to send us a chat. And like I said, think of all the questions that you want to ask, put them in the Q&A, and we will get to those. And at the end, we can connect with one another, I know virtually, to discuss and have follow-up conversations about this. So thanks for sticking with me through those administrative tasks. I want to get to the good part of introducing our phenomenal panel that we have today. So first and foremost, I'm going to introduce Maggie Hughes. She's a PhD student and research assistant within the MIT's Media Lab in the lab for social machines, where she's now exploring how conversations occur across different media. While there, she hopes to design methods and tools to ease and improve computer-mediated and in-person conversations with pointed design interventions. For her master's thesis, Maggie completed an ethnographic study and became trained in 4 conversation facilitation styles. From this study, she designed an online platform, Keeper, to scaffold, promote rich social presence in, and set the tone for online synchronous conversations. Before this work, Maggie studied various forms of mediated conversation, including polarized discourse around mass shootings on Twitter and radio call-in conversations across urban and rural divides. Within these analyses, Maggie began to understand the complexity of bias in data as automated speech recognition tools, tweet classifiers, and measures of group dynamics carry bias, especially against more marginalized groups. Thank you so much, Maggie, for joining us today. Melina Chinen is a data analyst at Olivia AI, a community savings app that uses AI to give personalized recommendations on how to spend smarter. Despite her studies in production engineering at Sao Paulo State University, she decided to change her career and start a new adventure in the world of data. Currently, she works close with the product team, helping them to better understand their users base. Thank you so much, Melina, for joining us as well. And the last panelist, Belen Saldias, is a second-year PhD student at the Lab for Social Machines at MIT. Belen has worked in various research projects where she has contributed to multiple domains, such as variational inference applications, human-computer interaction, online RCTs, and natural language processing. Before joining MIT, Belen worked at Harvard University as a research assistant with a focus on finding more efficient ways to create training sets, where she proposed a probabilistic graphical model to this end. Currently, she aims to understand and explore what child-aware NLP would entail. Amazing backgrounds of all three of our panelists, and I'm super, super excited to have this conversation with all three of you. I want to, before we kick off the discussion, I want to quickly just kind of provide some context around this topic. So design, when we're talking about design with algorithms or with analytics in general, we can think about it in a couple of different ways. So we can think about it from a design perspective of what are we going to do with this algorithm? What are we going to do with analytics that we are building? How do we design them? What data do we include? And finally, how do we design the technology to be able to capture this information properly and ensure that people are represented by these systems? So I want to kick off the discussion with each of you individually answering, what design means to you in your line of work. Maggie, do you want to kick us off on that?
Sure thing. So I think design is such an interesting and broad topic, and I guess when I think around what it means specifically when kind of studying communities online or studying the ways that people engage with one another and how we might design those studies, it seems like a way that we kind of, answer or find ways to answer very challenging problems that are deeply complex and nuanced. And so I think that gets to that point as well with the component of bias is when you design, because it is so complex and nuanced, there's so many different ways to approach answering problems. So designing, a variety of different solutions feels like simply a way to problem solve or find, not necessarily solutions, but maybe a process towards finding solutions to, complex nuanced problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Belen, do you have anything to add to that from your perspective on what design really means for you in this field?
Yes, maybe also kind of giving some more granularity to what Maggie just said, which is like the different stages in which you could think of design. So I'm just going to mention a few that relate a lot to my work, but it doesn't mean they're like all the areas that exist. So one stage is like when you collect data before even you analyze, right? And so how do you design that process? Who's invited to send their data? Or how do you, if you're going to go to the internet, how do you scrape that data? What are the concerns that you have? Is the user consenting on that? And then how do you decide the questions that you ask, right? I have this data. What are the questions that I'm going to ask? Are those fair questions? Are they carrying any bias? How are you going to use the responses? So in all those steps, and then you go even deeper and say, okay, now I'm gonna develop models. I have these models, but they're already conditioned on the bias that is present in the data. And I think you already talked about that last time. But also the models themselves need constraints. So how do we design for models that are able to maybe surface those biases, or maybe we find them somehow? So those are challenges we might discuss later here. And then the systems themselves, right? Once we deploy these, how the systems are interact with people are conditioned on how the designers, engineers, scientists think. And all that influences in the design. Are you doing research? Do you want to really kind of include the final user and all that? So all these different stages, I feel like, at least at the lab, we're trying to think about how to design.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Melina, I know you work on an application that actually helps people, organize their finances. And so from a technology design perspective, what kinds of considerations do you and your team think about when you're trying to make sure that that technology is representative of its end users?
Yeah, from my work perspective, designing for me is taking into the discussion all the stakeholders' interests. So we have to think, and also who is developing the product, who are our investors, but especially who are our users. What they expect from the app, what they want, which implications we're going to have with each of our decisions. So design for me is this, and also we need to understand what our machine learning models will represent for them, and to try to mitigate all the bias as possible for them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And tying design into the data collection process, obviously there's a design aesthetic on how you're actually collecting that data. There's a design aesthetic on how you're going to do the analysis. And then there's this integration process. So it's not just sitting there and thinking about, are we using proxies of different data sets, even though we're taking out like gender, for example. But it's also about how are these algorithms or this research, how's it going to be used and integrated into different systems? So, which I think actually is a huge missing component in my experience in the conversation. So of all of you, what are some best practices that you've seen organizations, either from a research side or an organization like a company, implement to ensure that these types of conversations are happening at the design process?
Yeah, so you ask, I think, two questions. One is, how do we see companies implementing this or raising these conversations? And also, what was the first part?
Basically understanding like the different components of where design is inserted into the process.
Right. Yeah. So I think there is a basic assumption, which is that one data set represents one person. And then with some people rushing to doing analysis, we've all done that. It's not like we've solved it completely, right? So I'm not saying like I'm a saint or whatever. But sometimes we fail into assuming, this data set is going to help us solve this problem, but we don't acknowledge that we're actually reducing people to this representation and say, now these people in like these 10 variables, this is how they behave, right? This is how they are. And even if you have a bigger data set with people, and now it's not only one person, it's going to represent only one subset of people, right? And even not entirely that subset even. So what we want to have in mind is say, like acknowledge very explicitly where the constraints under which our models would work and what would be the performance, right? And also that changes with time. So that's one thing that we need to super acknowledge. And as for practices, I was reading lately, and one of the things that I found regarding computer vision, I mostly work on natural language processing, but this is for computer vision. It could be easier for people to catch up the idea. Is that, for example, you have this data set. Of course, when you look at images, you might find they're violent or so. So one technique would be, for example, to go and blur all faces, right? And then even if you do create a data set where you do blur all faces, you don't want to have a license that gives access to all people, such as Creative Commons, to use it freely, right? You want to kind of have some control in case you later find that there is a problem with that. So kind of trying to have some control and being transparent and acknowledging that even if you haven't done an audit process in your data, you're still exploring that. But I think it's not an open process. And I wonder if like others would have more ideas on maybe good practices or how different institutions are handling the problem.
Yeah, I think I agree with what you were saying, Belen. And I think also to build on that as well, thinking of when you're doing these designs and you're saying, okay, we can't create these broad statements saying we design or this process represents everybody. So that's like one component, saying understanding that either the data that you're using is not representative of everybody, but thinking of a strategy to try to avoid those instances where you kind of use these broad statements to cover everybody in a way that maybe is misleading. I'd say one way to approach this as well is to try to intervene very, very early. So even when you're starting to ask those questions, making sure you understand the ecosystem that's at play, and knowing that, right, we're talking about how computational systems have bias, but we also have biases that we maybe don't understand or don't necessarily see completely. And so trying to find ways to understand that we don't see all people necessarily the same, and that we don't understand even the folks that we might be excluding. Like we might even not know there's a demographic that we're missing and not covering. And so something that can be really constructive about that is including folks that understand the social system that you might be partaking in early in the process, understanding that there's like what other demographics maybe you're trying to touch on that you might have missed unintentionally, or that you might have the potential to miss based off of the demographic of the researchers or the scientists or the computer folks. And so I think that's just like one strategy that, of course, doesn't, if you have the data set, it doesn't address it at that point, but saying if we can just intervene really early and say, let's get a more diverse group of folks that are kind of engaging with this topic, so we can identify who's excluded from this, what this data set actually covers, and being really transparent about that. So I think just bounding it and saying we are not trying to cover all of humanity, all of the US, we are trying to cover this amount, and we've missed this. Maybe we should go pursue these folks as well, but just being very clear. Because I think, last point, but I think that can be very harmful if you say we include everybody and then you don't include folks. That actively is erasing those folks, right? Or is excluding them from even existing. It's not acknowledging that they should be a part of it. So I think that can be really challenging when you don't include, but the language is, this is comprehensive.
Yeah, I agree with Belen and Maggie, and I also think that we need to understand that bias is going to happen anyway, and we need to be prepared for this. So maybe this involves monitoring or a feature tool, and collect the feedback from our users to understand also their point of view, and try to react based on this and train our model with those feedbacks, because we need to have always be prepared to adapt our model to them. And I think this complements all, to have a quality data set, to have people who have experience on this in these social capacities, but also to monitor when it happens, because it's going to happen anyway.
Also, maybe talking a bit about your point about like how companies are dealing with this. One good thing that's happening at MIT, at least, is that leaders are talking about this, so it kind of dissolves a bit the power dynamics. For example, I'm just going to be an example, not to say, oh, I'm a victim, whatever, but these live captioning systems just don't catch people with accents, right? So I was in this conference like 2 months ago or so, and then everyone was being live captioned, and I was like, this is so cool. But then I started talking and I got these weird random words. I was like, this is not fair, right? I'd rather not have them. So I didn't see that as a problem for me before, because I said, whatever, people are good with this. But then as soon as not as soon, but as MIT was talking about this, I felt powerful enough to say, hey, this system doesn't work with me. So sometimes those minorities, saying like people with accent in this case, do have those problems, but you don't really feel important enough to speak out, to speak up, right? So that's also a way which companies, I feel, are addressing these issues, that they say, let's talk about this, let's show that we're making mistakes as well, and let's maybe minorities or like people that are being affected by those biases speak up.
Yeah, I love that you're mentioning that too. That's kind of like an external impact or kind of a pressure potentially that is kind of forcing these organizations to have those conversations. I think one way internally as well is to be able to discuss the implications that these systems have. So to your point, Maggie, like we're going to have bias in our process. And if we decide that we are going to temporarily or permanently exclude this particular demographic, and we state that, how do we ensure that that's not going to be used incorrectly, number one, and number two, how do we communicate the implications of that properly? Like, what is the magnitude of the impact that that's going to have? Like, to your point, Belen, like it impacted you. And so how do we do that up front during the design process, go through those exercises to say, this is going to be the implication of leaving these people out?
Yes, and in that sense, there is a successful example living out this example that's still somehow weak, but like Google Translator. So there are languages that you have that are ungendered, I think it said, and then languages that are gendered. So for example, in English, you would say the doctor. And so you have like, you don't know the gender of that subject. But in Spanish, you would say either el for a male and la for a female. And so when you would write down, the doctor went to the hospital, the translator would automatically do el doctor, right? Like the male version. But since July, I think, or late June, they switched that. So anytime you write like the adjective or subject, sorry, they would like propose both ways as translation. So it's not like perpetuating biases in that sense. So I found that solution be pretty neat because it's like one step forward to solving those problems as well.
Are there other use cases or scenarios, either in research or in industry, that any of you have seen where they've either done it really well and they've thought about this ahead of time and put that additional thought process into the design, or they've failed, pretty drastically?
I think I've seen with speech again, like with accented speech, I've seen the same, and both with like foreign accented English speakers, like American English speakers, but then also just like Native American English speakers that deviate from the mainstream. So even if you have like a Southern accent or things like that, right? Alexa and all these different other like automatic speech recognizers like struggle with that. We see that with face recognition as well. A really incredible researcher at our lab, not in our specific lab, but within the media lab, within civic media, focused on specifically facial recognition and automatic facial recognition, and found huge disparities, especially for it, like I think it was IBM and a couple other different automatic facial recognition systems favored and was much more accurate with white people and with men specifically. And so then you can see that perpetuate inequality in a lot of ways as well. And so it seems like with facial recognition, that can be a big struggle too, outside of like speech. And it's interesting, I guess, you offering or asking that question of when you've seen it well, because I do find it challenging to think of a moment. But I think there's also just a lot more critique that is existing right now. But I'd be curious what others have to say.
To that case of the face recognition, so I was reading 2 months ago, and it was so IBM, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, I think, and they, after a couple analyses, decided to stop using those for facial recognition. So it seems they are kind of taking those considerations into account. So to the point of like who's doing it and thinking earlier, I think that's challenging, right? Because we didn't see those effects until those systems were well deployed, which is not necessarily the way to do it, but
right. Yeah, that's a point that I wanted to bring up as well. There's this whole when you're designing a product like this, like either a technology product that uses AI or AI that's like research, for example, there's this whole design component of not just that thing, but also the QA process. Like, what kind of testing and acceptance testing does this type of thing go through? What are the criteria that it has to pass? From that design perspective, have any of you had experience in contributing to the design of what that acceptance or quality looks like?
Maybe I can speak a bit to what we've been trying to do, which is, so I'm going to talk about an example. So we have these super powerful language models that generate text and like speak as fluently as people. And they are crazy good. They can generate dialogue. Some people get confused by them, but then you want to deploy them, right? How do you, for example, in specific case, we've been trying to work with kids, and I'm particularly interested in deploying those models for kids. And we might even be talking a bit more about safety concerns or unfairness, rather than necessarily many biases, even though in certain communities of kids you have some jargon and others different. So, but leaving that out, there is a problem. How do we make sure the model is safe enough or unbiased enough to be deployed for those kids, right? And so one approach that's been used, so people take those models, they fine tune those models, and then you have like the proportion of time the models make mistakes. This thinking about designing a system for deployment and how do you evaluate this part of the model. But then there is a concern how much each of the mistakes cost, right? So maybe if one time you said this is not safe, but it was actually a hello, you say, yeah, not cost at all. But then if you're talking about, say, a topic that is not adequate for kids, are you talking about that, that cost might be super high. And that's been also shown in different scenarios, which is adversarial attacks, when you have like a language models, and it's been shown that every time you append certain tokens, it always generates something that is racial offensive. And so all those evaluations are coming once the model is already developed. But there are also techniques that do develop to say, okay, let's try to define some dimensions that can generate biases, such as gender, race, and maybe money, right? And so they try to condition for the model to be agnostic to that, and then you also evaluate. But there is a lot going on, at least in the research community, specifically in the language community, which is we need to start testing our models better. And there is a lot of discussion around what are the actual evaluation metrics that we should be using. Because a lot of evaluation metrics go directly to either what's the proportion of time I get it right, but I get it right under a different model, right? And that model also presents some errors. So there is an idea of maybe go do mechanical Turk evaluation, maybe go to people. There is also an even deeper idea, which is you as a scientist, as someone who's doing analysis, should look into data. Because many people don't even look to a sample of 200 or 1,000 samples, like the generated image or the generated piece of text. And more than once we fail into that problem. So it's not like I'm talking from like, oh, you know, like I do also need to remind myself of do all those analyses of like, oh, what's the text that is actually generated? Because a low perplexity or like any other metric that we may be using doesn't mean that the model is actually doing what we want. So what I'm trying to say maybe is like it's not solved, but having the scientists be mindful and look at the data is super important, and we're not doing it because we're in the mindset of computational analysis, where the human isn't part of the loop in that sense.
Yeah, I love that example. You know, I've seen a lot of organizations setting up these monitoring systems to be able to monitor not just the model and the outputs and what is happening downstream, but also the data, because the data can change quite significantly as well, depending on the scenario. So if you have, you know, an application that you have a typical user base and that user base is coming in, all their interactions and data is being captured and then sent through this algorithm, and then their experience comes out on the other side. If that demographic changes drastically, that model you built may not be suitable for those people, those new users. And so I think it's extremely important to not just have those quality assurance conversations during the design process of like, we built this, here's the data we included, you know, we deployed this, but also over time, because they can have significant impacts that were unanticipated. So Melina, I want to ask a specific question for you, because you do you know, work and analytics on an application that has a user interface. Are there any specific, is there any specific data that you're capturing to get an understanding of whether or not the end user is understanding what the model is producing for them? Any kind of feedback mechanism?
Yeah, currently we had a new feature that is a social feature that where people can post in a feed, can leave comments and likes, and this is something to do with the feedback tooling that I was talking about. That we need to implement to make a moderation about the users understanding, but we also have a machine learning model that labels of the users transactions, and this is something that we do make a moderation about what is the percentage of errors that this model is returning to us, and this is something automatic that we are constantly improving. This is something that we analyze using our own data and and using our confidence level. Based on in our app, the user can change if the transaction is wrongly categorized. So we have received this feedback about the transaction. So we can compare which what our model pointed that it was a transaction, and which category the transaction should be, so we can see if we are in the right way or not. So basically, this is what we are currently doing.
Yeah, and I love that we're talking about the design, not just again of the algorithm itself, but the system in which the users are interacting with it, because there's a significant, I think, opportunity for us to continue adjusting the underlying intelligence technology to continuously keep up with the different types of users that tools are experiencing. Maggie, I would love to hear your thoughts on basically ensuring, like, what kind of criteria or rigor should we be going through before we say this is good for, you know, production, and we know what the implications could be.
Yeah, I think that kind of gets to a point too that I want to come back to that we spoke about earlier. And the idea of like being specific about who this is for and like what you're designing for and like bounding it. And I think a language that was used, and I can't remember what context, but it was like, oh, what if we exclude these people, and like, is that okay? And like, if we just define that. And I think that's where I'd want to like highlight specifically, like if we want to test to see if something is ready to go. I know a design principle that's often used in, at least in the Media Lab, that keeps getting brought up is this idea of like designing for the most marginalized or designing for the most at risk and designing in that space, and then being able to encapsulate more of those who are like less marginalized later. So the idea of, is it okay to exclude folks? And so if like, to say I designed a system and it worked only for like Boston folks, and it only worked for Boston, like in the town of, or the neighborhood of Fenway or something like that. And I said, okay, well, I bounded it, I'm just excluding everybody else. And now that bounding looks odd. And like, why would I design only for this group when this group is a tiny portion of the population, or the most privileged portion of the population that often gets benefits already? So why bound by them? So when I say being like honest about who you're designing for, like I think that's helpful, so you can also have this reflection moment of, oh, I'm designing for people that maybe I should be designing further out to folks that are experiencing more harm in the space. So when I think about like different ways that you can test your work to see if it's working or if it is like acceptable to be out in the world, I'd say first you need folks that are to like be working on that project, or you need to at least have knowledge of like, you know, whoever you want to deploy for, a very deep, like an intimate knowledge of understanding if it's for women, like what do women need, what are the struggles that they're experiencing and the complexities that come with that. But then if you're saying women, then how do you include trans women, or different definitions, or like different ways that people interpret gender? And so it's like, it can always be very complex. So the idea, the fundamental point that I'm trying to say is making sure that those edge cases and those that you perceive to be edge cases can use these tools and can experience benefit from these tools. And if so, feeling like that starts to be a point where you can give it the green light to go out, is when you know you're not causing more harm in the world. Or like, for example, even outside of like facial recognition, we talk about within the criminal justice system, we started to have these automatic tool or like supports for sentencing. but then those sentencing tools, right, are embedded with the same biases that might come from the humans that have either crafted them, or the data that's been trained is biased already. And so understanding that when you deploy that system, looking at who's the most vulnerable, like Belen was talking about children, and that's a very vulnerable population. And so being really intentional and saying, is that most vulnerable person or marginalized person going to be experience benefit from my tool, or am I going to harm them more? And so I think if it's positive, then that feels like a nice threshold to say this is ready to go out into the world. But also I think a nice reflective practice is kind of experiencing doubt often, and kind of not being sure that it's out, ready to go out in the world, and constantly iterating and reflecting, I think can be a really positive practice. So even if you send it and you missed something, just, that's okay. Just iterate and make sure it's not causing harm before you send it out again, is my thoughts.
Yeah, I totally agree. Also want to build a bit more upon of the original questions, because I know we've been talking about maybe things are, maybe the audience doesn't feel so empowered to go to their companies and say, okay, let's do this. But there are small ways where we can also help, right? I know that I spent 1 year or so in industry, and I know the idea of get it out quickly, we're always late for this product to be out. So I know that pressure, but in that sense, you can also be innovative. And I know people might be thinking, oh, I don't have the power. And I know that's hard. So I want to say that I know that might be hard, but there are simple things that we could do. So for example, 2 weeks ago, I was applying to this thing at the university, at the institute, and I saw a form that asked gender, male identify, female identify, prefer not to say, other, and then explain your pronouns. And I found that, okay, my kid is leading this area, but then I was scrolling on Facebook, and I found this company's form to apply for a job, and it said gender, male, female. Next question. What if I don't want to say it? What if I other? That company was already excluding me, right? And then it had all sort of questions that way as well. Not space for say other, no space for not to say. What if? Yeah. So I'm not working for that company, right? But all those people that are maybe middle level managing positions, they also have the power to make those changes, right? To be more inclusive, to design their systems, are their processes to be more inclusive for people. So it's not only about machine learning, not only about maybe deploying system for social justice, it's also about being mindful of the decisions we're making in those systems that can affect thousands of people, right? And there is all this inequality of people accessing systems, and as soon as we decide male, female, all the rest is out, right? And it's not it takes forever to think, oh, what options do I put, right? It's you can follow some guidelines. And yeah, so try to, if you find yourself with no time enough to kind of make those changes, maybe think about the small things that may be excluding people.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Because the algorithm or the analysis is only going to be as good as the data, and so you decide to exclude context at every stage of the process. You say, we're going to collect this information. You're already excluding context. It's so challenging to capture the essence and complexity of the real world. And so, you're going to make those decisions along the way. I think documenting them along the way and saying, we've excluded this is what this means. And we can go back and decide that that's an important thing that we need to readdress. The other thing we're talking about here too is this threshold of acceptance. I asked you all what the quality components look like that we should be considering, but there's this level where we're saying yes or no, and there's these implications that we're talking about and we're explaining, and somebody has to make the call that that's okay. And that's an ethical conversation, not a technical one. And to your point, Belen, what empowers and what enables data scientists or analysts in their organizations to say, I disagree with that, or that's not okay. And our next topic is actually around policies and standards around this. What can we do from a legal perspective to ensure we're enforcing that? but there's still a lot of room to be able to do that. So have any of you been a part of those types of conversations? I know, Belen, you give us a really good example of something that you could do, which is saying, like, let's start collecting this type of data, or making these options available. But have any of you been part of more of those like ethical conversations that don't have to do with like this specific variable means this thing? And how do you navigate that? Because I think that's the big question for a lot of people that attend these events.
Maybe I can say how I struggle navigating that. So I'm trained as an engineer, right? So I come to the lab and I'm like presented with these possibilities. Then what do? I have like other colleagues in the lab that bring that knowledge, right? Or like different people. But that's a challenge, it's not solved. And one way is to expose oneself to those communities. So for example, attending like CS conferences, we often have like these panels when we will have experts talking about like how, like, let's say language, how to deploy or develop language models or language, whatever, natural language models, being mindful of the ethical concerns. And now there is the most popular conference in machine learning, which is NeurIPS. They, along with having a checklist for reproducibility, where any other researcher could reproduce it, so you're not introducing all these tricks. They also have a statement that the researchers need to discuss the ethical concerns in there. So the technical area is advancing towards that side, but it's not that we as engineers are also trained for that. So it's a constant struggle. Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like it's pretty typically a cultural thing. You know, there's the organization either finds it to be valuable to do and enforce, or they don't. And I know Renee in the last discussion had mentioned that this should be really part of like the interview process. Like when you're interviewing data scientists and designers and people in your organization, you know, these are the types of questions you should include in that interview process. It shows you as an organization care about it very seriously, and it allows you to kind of make sure that you're hiring the right people. We do have sorry, go ahead.
To that point, I feel like diversity in the team itself is valuable rather than having only one person that, like, you know, a unicorn that would do data science deployment and I would do ethics. So it's good to have like that kind of some of that background as well. But diversity will not only bring you like these different knowledges, but also like people that will bring different like experiences of life, which at the end of the day, which are you're trying to serve with technology. Right, so diversity, I don't think we've touched too much on that, but I think it's crucial.
Yeah, I believe I agree with Belen. I believe that, for example, in Olivia, we work in multidisciplinary groups, and there was a discussion about if we should or should not include manual transactions in your app, because currently we only use the transactions that we get from the bank accounts or credit cards. But the reality in Brazil is that a lot of people are autonomous workers, and they get paid with money in cash, or they do a lot of things with cash. So this should be a feature that if we do implement, we would be able to include this type of people that usually are people who has a lower acquisition capacity. They don't have higher incomes, so this would definitely be something that we can use to improve even more our app.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent example of the power that diverse teams can bring to the thought process of designing your product to represent its users properly. We do have a couple of questions from the audience that I do want to bring up. There's one question that says, how do you tackle unconscious bias, especially in a day and age where we develop products for global audiences? there are chances of cultural bias coming into the design without us being able to cognitively differentiate it as a bias. Have any of you come across such a scenario?
Yeah, unconscious bias is a very popular topic, or it keeps coming up, which is good that people are understanding it. And so just for clarification, in case that idea, right, that we were just talking about it as well, that we all carry biases, but we might not be aware of it. So like if I am biased against people of the opposite gender, not, actively discriminating against them, but maybe having like emotional responses to when I see them or engage with them or things like that. And so that frame of the global audience and designing for a global audience is really interesting. And I think it comes to that point of us kind of talking about designing for everybody falling under this umbrella. And so thinking, even folks like, I'm in Boston right now, and even that the like cultural experience in Boston is very different than the cultural experience in San Diego, even in with one country, let alone like this larger, and then even urban and rural has very different experiences. So I think that's like a very lofty goal, and one that is, I admire this pursuit to design something at that scale. But when thinking about it too, something around designing for folks that have very different lived experiences. And if you want both of those users to be able to use the tool in a similar way, or whatever you're designing for in a similar way, I think it requires such a great deal of time spent with the person or with like that kind of group, or understanding that more. So one idea, for example, is designers acting more so as the facilitators of like some design or some algorithm to come out, and just rather than necessarily the person driving that specifically. So this is coming from like a very much a design perspective, of the sense that users are experts in their own right, and so they understand things of their own experience more deeply than we ever can. So for example, if I have unconscious bias, it shouldn't necessarily be that I'm going to try to design and push through that bias, but rather I wonder about listening to the group that you were designing for, and kind of letting that knowledge drive the design process, rather than your knowledge, because it might be tainted in some way. You might not know everything in some way.
So yeah, like
so
a market research element of the design process.
Yeah. And having some level of like communication or relationship with folks that you're designing for.
Awesome. I'm going to move on to the next question, because we're getting a few here. So there's another one that says, I would love to hear your thoughts about the democratization of data. It's something we are working on in my industry, which is higher ed. And so they're curious, what kind of implications that democratizing data would have specifically on this topic.
Yeah, so maybe one thought, and then people can chime in. The idea of democratizing data and like making it available for everyone, I think it's a great idea, and also carries some concern of like maybe increasing the gap of those who already have access to technology and those who not. So that can be okay to understand. And then we have one complication, which is, for example, an email that we got a couple of days ago from MIT saying, now every video that you put out on the internet needs to have closed caption. So as MIT, we cannot publish any video on the MIT website with no closed caption, right? Because we're making all this content and knowledge available. But what about those who can't hear, right? So, and so in the sense that we do create technology, and it's a challenge of how to prevent increasing the gap between those who have access and those who not. And the same happens with machine learning, right? You democratize that, this is great, more people have access, but those people that never had a computer, never learned to read or so, the gap is bigger. So maybe one way of thinking is like, how do we try to provide democratizes, but not for those who already have access to the internet, but also to those who don't know how to open a CSV file, right? So kind of trying to bridge that gap, that would be a dream.
Any other thoughts on that topic?
Just echoing what you said, Bill, and I think that I know it's really great to be able to like download a huge data file from like your Facebook or Spotify, but I think it feels almost impossible to do anything with it unless you have some scaffolding or support. So I empathize as well. I think democratization of data is hugely important, and also just pushing one step further, saying, can we make it more accessible for folks through like some sort of support or scaffolding as well for education?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I see the technology landscape lending itself towards more of an easier kind of experience trying to navigate through data. And it'll be really fascinating to see how some of these technologies develop over time to allow more populations of people to be able to look at data, understand data, do something with it, and be able to have an opinion and influence what's happening. I think right now too, and Belen, you talked about education. A big component of this is that a lot of people, most of society doesn't even know that this all is happening under the hood, and they don't understand what's happening or the implications of that. And so if you have an issue with how you're interacting with some technology, where do you even start those conversations, or how do you even start those conversations? So I think that's definitely a really, really interesting question. So thanks to whoever asked that question. We only have a couple of minutes left, which is crazy. This always flies by so fast. We did get one more question that I want to close out with, which is understanding, where do all of you get your resources from? Like, what are you reading? What do you follow, if you follow anything? What are kind of the top resources that you would recommend or suggest to people listening?
So about these topics of fairness and mitigation bias, there is a team from Google that is called PAIR. It's AI research team, and they have a lot of material about those subjects from also from the AI, machine learning, but also design perspective. They have TED talks, and it's really good to see, even if you don't have much familiar with these topics.
Sorry, I think there's a couple of conferences as well that focus on this specifically. I know one that was FATSTAR and now has changed, I think, to like FACT, like FACCT, but it's like fairness and accountability. And so if you're looking for like papers where people are researching specifically how things are biased or unfair, that's like a nice place to look. There's a lot of incredible researchers that publish there.
That's great. Belen, do you have any resources that come to mind?
Maybe add one extra, which is Twitter. You can go and look like ML or AI and bias, and then you'll find all these discussions, and then you can kind of make up your own mind. But also many times you'll point to these resources we're talking. Yeah, not saying that's a ground truth, but it's a good way to look for resources.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you all. I appreciate you all participating in this conversation. I think it's an extremely important conversation. I know a lot of people are trying to educate themselves more on this topic. So, we appreciate you taking the time to prepare for this conversation, this discussion, and provide your experiences and expertise on this topic. So thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to, real quick before we jump off of it, there's one more slide I just want to show everybody for the upcoming event that we have in 2 weeks on September 2nd. We're going to be talking about policies and standards in artificial intelligence and analytics. And so we'll be joined with Nicole Alexander and Kendra Clark. So I'm really excited about that discussion as well. So if you're interested in continuing this conversation, we will be sending out a follow-up email with this recording and a link to register for that event. In addition to that, I do want to post in the chat to everybody the link for the networking event. So this is a separate link. Once you click this, it will take you out of the webinar completely. So just know when you click it, you're going to drop off the webinar, which is fine. And I will meet you over there in a few minutes. And we'll get started in about 5 minutes or so. So I'm posting the link in the chat. So if you are interested in sticking around, meeting other attendees, and networking, feel free to join us there. Any closing remarks or final words from the panelists?
just huge thank you for having us. It's been great talking with all of you.
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity. It's a great topic to know more, and I think everyone should pay more attention to these issues.
Same. Thank you everyone.
Awesome. Thank you all so much again. I really appreciate your time. And we'll see everybody over at the networking session. And if not, have a great rest of your Wednesday. And, hopefully we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thank you.
Great.